Science with Sanjula, where we talk about anything global health. My name is Sanjula Singh, and I am a researcher at the University of Oxford. Join me as I speak to world-leading scientists who tackle today's biggest challenges in healthcare. Today we're in the studio with Professor Sir Rory Collins, where we'll be discussing leadership in global health and setting up large prospective studies such as the UK Biobank.
I'm Rory Collins. I'm the head of the Nuffield Department of Population Health in Oxford.
I would like to go back, I think, 67 years now, because you were born in Hong Kong. Isn't that correct?
I was born there in January 1955.
And for how long did you actually live in Hong Kong?
When I was 9, I came back to England to go to prep school and then to Dulwich College in South London, and then went from there to medical school.
You studied medicine at St Thomas Hospital Medical School, part of London University, if I'm not mistaken. And then you studied statistics at George Washington University, and then you came to Oxford. So I think those in total, I believe, 12 years of education. Am I right in assuming that you enjoyed being a student?
No, it wasn't that so much that when I was at school, I had really enjoyed mathematics. But when I went to the careers officer and said, well, what can you do with mathematics? They said, well, you can become an actuary, which sounded about as boring as one could imagine. A friend was saying, well, I'm going to medical school. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. So I applied to Cambridge to do natural sciences because I thought I could mix mathematics for a couple of years and then do medicine. But I didn't get in. So I went to St Thomas's, and after the first 2 years, I wondered, well, could I do the extra year that you can do at medical school in London in statistics? So in 1976, I went to Washington, D.C. The university statistics department was run by some of the biggest names in statistics in the U.S. Jerry Cornfield, Nathan Mantell, who developed the Mantel-Haenszel test that has been used for meta-analysis. And they had set up the cancer statistics group in the NCI and then had retired, and they had were running the statistics department at George Washington University and had set up a clinical trials unit, the Biostatistics Center in Bethesda, where they employed me for 1 day a week.
And is it there where you fell in love with randomized trials? Could one say that, or?
Yeah. I worked with a guy called John Lekeen, a statistician, on a National Institute of Health funded trial of chenodeoxycholic acid for dissolving gallstones. Didn't work, but the whole concept of randomisation for me became very clear as to why it was so valuable. And then I applied to do the Masters in Statistics at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and came back to finish off my medical degree and did my house jobs, first in London and then in Stoke-on-Trent. And I had read the book by Peter Armitage on statistics in clinical research, which was a kind of seminal book. And I talked to him about what I'd like to do, and he said, "Well, you should talk to Richard Peto." And I went out with Richard, and he said, "Well, I think I've got an idea for you. We could, you could come and spend a year doing some research." And the position that I got offered was one where Richard had some funding to run the statistics for the MRC leukemia trials. The leukemia trials had been set up by a chap called Humphrey Kay in London. And they were very successful in recruiting patients into trials. But there really wasn't a great understanding about randomized trials, interestingly. And so there were problems in the way in which those trials were run. And as a result, the MRC moved the trial conduct to Oxford to be run properly. And there was a lot of work that needed to be done to actually rectify some of the older trials to get follow-up of patients who had been inappropriately withdrawn. So I was funded essentially to do that. But what I was mainly really working on was an idea that Richard had for a long time, which was to try to get large randomized trials in chronic diseases, that the trials had been too small. He had linked up with Peter Sleight, who was a professor of cardiology, and Salim Yusuf, who was a Rhodes Scholar from India. So they had got funding to support a large trial of intravenous beta blocker in the emergency setting of a heart attack. And they needed someone to run it. So I was funded to work on the MRC leukemia trials. I worked on those and went around the hospitals trying to get follow-up of patients. But the main thing was to try to get this trial off the ground.
That sounds very exciting, but quite the task. Starting out in research, that's not a small job to start off with. How does one actually set something like that up? Because it sounds like a big endeavor.
Well, it was finding like minds. It was finding people where one could explain, randomization is a great idea, but if you don't randomize enough people, if you have large random errors, then yes, you avoid the bias by having randomization, but you miss being able to either detect or rule out moderate improvements in survival. These were all the concepts that Richard had, but had never really found anyone to deliver them. And it was the kind of coming together of a cardiovascular question, a company that was willing to support it and work with academics on it, and then going out to first people in the UK, hospitals in the UK, and persuading them. And then within each hospital, persuading the junior doctors to think about putting patients into the trial in the middle of the night when they were busy. And the key thing there was keeping it very, very simple. So all they had to do was pick up the phone, answer a few very simple questions, and then they were told, take a treatment pack and give it or not. We engaged our coronary care unit in Oxford to deal with answering the phone calls. But we kind of created this network, and it was that approach which was used most recently in 2020 in the recovery trial. Very, very simple, asking a very few simple questions, then telling people, take this treatment or not, and engaging the junior doctors, making it possible for the junior doctors to be part of not just having to deal with the problem, but actually creating the solutions, finding the answers to what things work.
And would you then go there yourself? Would you travel to all those centers and talk to the junior doctors as well? Or how in practice would that work?
Yeah, I was doing the treatments on the coronary care unit here in Oxford, randomizing the patients. But I went round the hospitals in the UK, talking about the trial, why it made sense, why the strategy made sense. We didn't know whether the treatment would or wouldn't work.
Did you decide whilst doing all these trials that is really what you would like to do for the rest of your career? Or did you maybe take it more year by year or a few years by a few years? How was your approach?
Well, I came to Oxford in August 1981. The ISIS-1 trial was a success in the sense of demonstrating you could get large numbers of patients randomized in such a trial. But the results were pretty equivocal. It wasn't clear that beta blocker was beneficial. ISIS-2 transformed people's views about the value of large randomized trials, because up till then they said, well, if you need to randomize 17,000 patients, the effect can't be big enough to be worthwhile. And then you get the result, and you see a reduction of 20% in mortality with streptokinase, a reduction of another 20% with the addition of aspirin. If you treat early enough, it's more than a halving in mortality in a condition where nothing had worked before. Yeah. There's nothing like an exemplar to change people's views. And in fact, before ISIS-2 finished, I went to the British Heart Foundation and said we should survey what people are doing now and then repeat the survey a year after the results came out. And that was really quite interesting, because prior to the results coming out, while ISIS-2 was going on, no one was using streptokinase, no one was using aspirin. A year after the results, everybody was using it routinely. And so it also put the end to the, if you like, the lie that randomized trials don't change practice. randomized trials that don't produce clear answers don't change practice. But if you do trials which are big enough to demonstrate that treatments work, or indeed that they don't work, then they can change practice. And so the ISIS-2 trial made a difference. And so I had something from that work. But up till then, you're very, very dependent on working with people who look after you. And that's something you really do remember, and I really do think about. That is particularly in epidemiology, clinical trials, everything takes a long time, and you're not going to get anything for a long period of time, and you need to be looked after. And I was looked after, particularly by Richard, but also by Peter Sleight, by Salim, supported, and I think that's critical for young researchers.
I would like to move on to another part of the interview, and that is on how to tackle misinformation. Well, you're not only, of course, the head of the Department of Population Health here in Oxford, but you are the chair of many committees. You're very well known throughout the UK and throughout the world. And so if you will make a statement about any part of health, people will listen.
Well, I think one has a role to try to inform one's clinical colleagues, as well as the public. If you're doing epidemiological research, then the most important thing to remember is that you're doing it not in order to be right or clever or whatever, but you're doing it in order to improve public health.
I remember this paper in the BMJ published where I think people were saying
there should be a moratorium on the use of cholesterol-lowering treatments. It was a massive, massive error, and one that caused a lot of damage.
And I felt like you really took control there, and very, very honest also on the BBC4 interview, saying that you felt that it was misinformation. I think you even called it, quote, irresponsible journalism and misleading publishing. Do you still feel as though that is still true?
Yeah, absolutely. It was, I think, disinformation, so deliberate misinformation. The situation had been transformed from the previous period with cholesterol lowering by the availability of statins. They're probably among the most carefully studied and extensively studied drugs. The heart protection study we did in the UK with funding from Merck and Roche, we tested vitamins in a factorial design, but also funded by the British Heart Foundation and the Medical Research Council, was the largest trial with 20,000 patients, 5 years of treatment, and very, very careful follow-up in patients, particularly asking about muscle symptoms every time the patient came in. So we had very, very detailed information in that trial, but then there were a series of trials. And before any of them came out, I realized that some of them may not be big enough to test questions of cardiovascular mortality, and that there would likely be questions about the effects in different types of patients. So I wrote to the principal investigators of those trials and said, why don't we put together a prospective protocol that we will combine our trial results after everybody's published their individual results. So we'll combine individual patient data from these statin trials so that at the end of the process, there is the largest possible database on efficacy and safety. And the focus of that was going to be on cardiovascular outcomes from an efficacy perspective, mortality, in terms of cause-specific mortality, and cancer from a safety perspective. And we set up the so-called cholesterol treatment trial as collaboration. We got individual patient data from each of the trials once they had completed their publications. And we all worked together to bring together those analyses and published them in great detail in The Lancet. We didn't own the data. Everybody's data was their own. They always had the right to withdraw those data, but we worked collaboratively. And so at the end of that process, when there had been all of these trials in patients who had heart disease, patients who didn't have heart disease, patients who were elderly, large numbers of men, large numbers of women, people at different levels of cholesterol, people with diabetes, people with hypertension. I mean, a very, very extensive database, all carefully collated, all published very, very extensively, where each of the trials had also published on their adverse outcomes.
And Rory, next to the importance of large randomized controlled trials, isn't there also a need for large observational studies?
From around the end of the 90s, we were trying to get support to set up some large prospective observational studies. But there was very little appetite for it. And then by chance, we got an opportunity to put in an application to the Kadoorie family in Hong Kong. And they were willing to support the establishment of a prospective study in China, the China Kadoorie Biobank. And Zhengming Chen, with his team, in collaboration with the Chinese Academy of Medical Sciences, identified 5 rural and 5 urban areas of China that were selected on the basis that they had good disease surveillance teams that would be able to run the study, and also would be likely to be able to follow up, at least for death and cancer. But it was really the Medical Research Council and the Wellcome Trust deciding that they were going to set up a large prospective study in the UK Biobank, at the beginning of the century.
So, Rory, now I would like to invite you to give a mini lecture of about 1 minute about the UK Biobank.
UK Biobank, the idea was to recruit 500,000 men and women, middle age, old age, and follow them long term. The driving force was really to use this resource to understand the association of genetics with disease. But it obviously provided an opportunity to look at all sorts of different exposures, environmental, lifestyle, familial history, and genetics on subsequent health outcomes. So the MRC and the Wellcome Trust really had a couple of constraints. Needed to be 500,000 people, they needed to be kind of middle and old age, and they had already decided on a budget. So there was this amount of money. And the study was launched in 2003 and spent 2 or 3 years trying to work out what to do, what questions to ask, what measurements to make, what samples to collect, not knowing what analyses one would be doing in 20 years' time. I think the successes of UK Biobank are to recruit 500,000 people within the available budget and on time. But that's down to the altruism of the British people. People were willing to give their data, give their information, and get nothing back. We don't give any feedback of individual results to participants. When I was asked to take UK Biobank on in 2005, we were probably in a particularly fortunate situation of having the IT, having the kind of pilot experience in China, that we could. The experience in the large-scale randomized trials, of all these things we could pull together. And so there was a success in terms of delivery. The other thing that the funders wanted was that they wanted a resource that everybody would use. And so once we had got the recruitment, we put in place the access policy, which was that it would be available to all researchers, academic and commercial, and we got consent from the participants on that basis, on exactly the same basis, anywhere in the world. And I think the first major finding was the demonstration from the data that the whole idea that you could combine genetic variants of small effect and identify a sizable proportion of the population who were at high risk of a particular disease. Once we got the genotyping data, people were doing all sorts of things with it. There was actually a PhD student who did the first study showing that a polygenic risk score, combination of genetic variants across the genome, all having small adverse effects on cardiovascular disease could be combined, and you could find 3 to 5% of the population that had a risk of coronary artery disease equivalent to someone with familial hypercholesterolemia, which is about 1/10 as common. And then others have gone on to show that the same is true for breast cancer, the same is true for colorectal cancer, the same is true for prostate cancer, the same is true for diabetes. And so, you can do polygenic risk score on population, and you can find about a quarter of the population that are in the top 3 to 5% for a number of different conditions.
Which I think in itself is already such an establishment, because people didn't think that would be possible. And maybe by having a project like the UK Biobank, more people are hopefully keen to set up similar projects all around the world. Are you familiar with, are people sometimes contacting you and saying, well, I'm from this country here or there. I would like to do something else. Could you advise me on that?
The thing about a project like UK Biobank is it's a very big undertaking. The key thing is you want to have the widest range of exposures and the widest range of disease risks. But the idea that you have to have these cohorts everywhere, I think, is the wrong one. You need to have them in a number of places where you will get an increase in the range of exposures or an increase in the range of diseases. If you want to study hemorrhagic stroke, study it in China because it's common there. The risk factors for hemorrhagic stroke that are identified in China will be relevant to the UK, to the US. And I think that's a message that's sometimes lost. So understandably, there is a desire to set up prospective cohorts across Africa, across India. And that would be important and valuable. But it's also worth bearing in mind that the UK Biobank data set would be of value to researchers in Africa as well. And encouraging researchers in Africa and India to believe that only data in their own countries is of value, I think, is a misrepresentation.
Our very final question, and we ask that to every guest in the podcast, is if you could give one advice, both on a professional and on a personal level, for current students or aspiring students to Oxford, what would you advise them?
Well, I think on a professional level, the key thing is to decide, what matters to you. What do you enjoy doing? Not what you've been indoctrinated into thinking is success, but what do you want to achieve? And if it's in epidemiology, then I think the key focus has to be on making an impact. Making an impact on health and thinking global. Don't think parochially about what matters in the UK or indeed parochially about what matters in India or in Africa. I mean, think global and focus on what matters, and don't be dissuaded. I think the key thing professionally to be successful is to find an environment where you are supported and helped to find your strengths. So I think that would be my professional advice. And also, don't take advice from other people because they haven't got any skin in the game. So that's always the problem with giving advice. On a personal level, I think the thing with this kind of research is it's all encompassing. So in a way, you get so engaged in it, it is your personal life, and that is very hard. I certainly can't advise on how you get the balance right on that. I just got so engaged in you getting these fantastic opportunities to do studies that I felt could make a difference. And I think the work-life balance is a tough one to achieve, and I can't say it's one that I've managed to achieve.
Are there things you try to do to maintain that balance?
Well, I enjoy playing tennis badly. Well, I'd like to play tennis better. I think something where you find you're not thinking about work and the frustrations of work, whatever that is for you. And for me, tennis has been the time when I've been able to switch off. I think that particularly the period where I was having to talk about statins in a way that I would have preferred not to have to do, an hour or so on the tennis court was where my mind was clear of that.
Thank you so much for joining us today in the studio, Rory. I had such a blast talking to you. And to all of our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Science with Sanjula. Please remember to subscribe and follow us on your favorite podcasting platform.